bona tarda, buenas tardes. Good afternoon, graduates and guests. It is a true honor to take part in this solemn graduation ceremony for the academic year 2023-2024 of the Barcelona School of Economics, BSE, a center of international renown in education and research. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank Professor Teresa Garcia Milà, director of the BSE and an old friend. And I really appreciated her invitation, and she knows that to me this ceremony holds a special significance. So apart from thanking Professor Garcia Milà, of course, and this is the most important thing, I would also wish to enthusiastically congratulate you on the significant life milestone that today's graduation represents. And I must confess that when Professor Garcia Milà called me to invite me to join you this afternoon, to me it was not trivial how to write this speech, how to make this address, because on a day overloaded with emotions for you, it is not at all obvious what a person like me could explain to you that might be useful in the very important stage you will inaugurate after obtaining your master's degree. After careful consideration, I have decided to share with you a few personal reflections, not necessarily in a coherent order, on the importance of a solid technical education like the one the BSE has provided you from my perspective of a quarter-century-long career as a professional economist. I was born in Barcelona in 1975. I graduated, as Teresa said, in economics and business sciences from Pompeu Fabra University in 1997. And the following 2 years, I completed a very demanding, at least this is my view, Master's in Economics and Finance at the Center for Monetary and Financial Studies, called CEMFI, associated with the Bank of Spain in Madrid. And to me, it's crystal clear that my degree in economics and above all, my masters from CEMFI have been decisive in my professional journey. The trajectory of one's career, as you know, is shaped by a variety of factors, such as obvious ones, as personal temperament, the gradual accumulation of experience, and of course, luck. Luck is very important in life. However, what I would like to underline today is that I have always approached the diverse jobs I have had on the basis of the technical and intellectual architecture of my training as an economist, which, in my opinion, is only possible, is only feasible, if this training comes from a center of excellence like CEMFI, or what is more important today, the BSE. Allow me to explain it better with a personal anecdote. In the last year of my undergraduate studies at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, 1996-1997, I served as a research assistant for half a year to Professor of Economics Andreu Mascolell. Andreu Mascolell is a very well-known figure at BSE, and probably Mascolell is the living Spanish academic economist with the highest international prestige. At that time, at the age of 21, I was somewhat unwished because I had many doubts on what path to take after my graduation as an economist. So I decided to ask Professor Mascolell for advice. I explained to him in a flustered manner that I explained to him many things. First, that I wanted to continue my training in economics without pursuing a doctorate, and that secondly and subsequently, I aspired to find a job in the private sector with a high technical component that could, in the future, be compatible with the development of a blurred public vocation that beat within my inner self. As you can see, I presented Andreu Mas-Colell with quite a conundrum. His serene and wise response became one of the most valuable pieces of advice I have ever received. Mr. Lucena, Andreu Mas-Colell, said, do not complicate matters and stop going around in circles. What you have to do is complete your training in economics with a master's program at a prestigious center, and once you finish, you will see what you dedicate yourself to. The options are varied, but the only important thing now is that you acquire solid technical foundations that will accompany you for life. Precisely, today's graduation ceremony of the various master's programs at the BSc ritualizes, so to speak, the acquisition of sophisticated technical knowledge that, due to the prestige of the BSc and the effort you have made, will constitute a substantial part of the intellectual capital with which you will build your professional careers in the coming decades, whatever the specific jobs you may undertake. This is, at least from my perspective, one lesson. Likewise, the unquestionable positive effect of psychological security in the form of self-esteem that a good training program confers should not be underestimated, and as it will also be a structural asset in the professional field. I will now present some illustrative, so it means non-exhaustive, examples of the type of issues in which I believe my economic training has been valuable over the past 25 years, a quarter of a century. The truth is that when I look back and simultaneously think about the professional future of my two children, aged 6 and 8 respectively, I conclude that I have had so far an unusually heterogeneous professional career. My career began in 1999 as an economic analyst in a consultancy firm and has led me to the position of chairman and CEO since 2018 of the largest airport company in the world and one of the largest Spanish companies with a market capitalization of almost 30 billion euros. Before joining Aena, I have been in the Spanish Public Innovation Agency, the European Space Agency, a major security and defense engineering company, a big bank, and even a 3-year period, as Teresa said, as the spokesperson for a parliamentary group in the Parliament of Catalonia. I honestly believe that the only common thread of such a plural career is my economic training. Honestly, I see no other. Firstly, in my 5 years as an economic analyst, I produced reports, among other matters, on macroeconomic analysis of different countries, monetary policy, labor market reforms, competition policy, energy regulation, and telecommunications regulation. The economic fundamentals at that time that I had acquired in undergraduate studies and, above all, in the Masters in Economics and Finance were essential not only to perform my job in a minimally diligent manner, but also to instill in me a particular presence of mind, especially valuable during the first professional steps, which, as you know, are not generally exempt from insecurities and uncertainty. Secondly, as the Director General of the Innovation Agency within the Spanish government that fosters private R&D through grants, soft loans, venture capital, and public purchases, it's called CDTI, the Center for Industrial Technological Development. My knowledge, on the one hand, of the microeconomic conceptual framework of market failures, and on the other hand, of statistics and econometrics was of great help. Really, it was. This economic knowledge enabled me to modestly contribute to the design of public funding instruments to boost private R&D, activity which constitutes a textbook market failure, whose effectiveness can only be empirically contrasted ex post through the application of sophisticated econometric methods. Additionally, in those years, it was from 2004 to 2010, in those years, as I was saying, understanding the fundamental relevance that technological change and innovation have in the evolution of the economy's productivity and GDP per capita growth, facilitated the constant exercise of persuasion that a group of economists that I was part of, along with, for example, Miguel Sebastián, carried out within the government of Spain to place a modern and technically well-founded industrial and innovation policy among the emblems of the government's economic policy. Thirdly, although it may seem surprising, even in the turbulent, rough, and often irrational terrain of pure politics represented by parliamentary activity, to which I dedicated 3 years, I'm convinced that good economics fundamentals are valuable for at least 2 reasons. The first reason is that no competent economist, as you are, could forget or can forget the budget constraint that operates in a large number of proposals that are debated and approved in a parliament. Remember that the historical origin of parliaments is precisely the elaboration of public budgets. This origin dates back to late medieval England, in which the king, on the one hand, and the representatives of the nobility, the church, and the incipient bourgeoisie, on the other hand, decided to institutionalize the political process of discussion on public spending, particularly military spending, and its financing through taxes. The second reason to appreciate sound economic principles in a parliament is that international experience teaches us that a plethora of well-intentioned laws failed miserably in the past because they simply ignored the underlying economic factors of the activity they intended to impact. That means that these laws that failed miserably, in fact, did not adequately evaluate the deleterious effects of the measures. The list of examples of certain price regulations that worsen the problem they intended to solve and measures that cost excessive public spending or the undesired modification of the incentives of economic agents is endless, believe me, endless. Fourthly, Aena, the company for which I have been working for the last 6 years, is the owner, as Professor Garcia Milá mentioned, is the owner and or responsible for the management of 64 airports in Spain, the UK and Brazil, in addition to having a presence in Mexico and Colombia. A relevant part of the airport activity, what we could call the pure aeronautical activity, is subject to economic regulation. In addition, naturally, to other normative obligations related to safety, service quality, and the environment. The economic regulation that I mentioned is articulated through maximum prices for airport services charged by the airport company because, and this is what is important, because due to good microeconomic reasons, it is understood that a significant number of airport infrastructures have features of a natural monopoly. That is, airports, the majority of airports, possess a certain level of market power. As you know, a natural monopoly is a type of market failure that, in the absence of public intervention and economic regulation, leads to higher prices and lower levels of quality and investment than the technically efficient market solution. With these personal examples, I hope that I have convinced you that after obtaining the master's from the BSc, the range of jobs in which you can employ the technical knowledge learned in this academic year is truly wide. Compared to the time when I started my professional career, it is clear that many things have changed. Today, for example, corporate ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance, the omnipresence of the struggle against climate change, digitization, artificial intelligence, and data processing, or the tectonic movements in the near future that will come from demography, migratory flows, and geopolitics, are aspects that have acquired enormous importance and that were not present so intensely when I began my professional career. And they will have, and they are having, strong reverberations in any professional sphere. However, it is always wise to bear in mind the admonition of two great microeconomists, Carl Shapiro and Hal Varian. In their beautiful 1999 book, they said, and I have always remembered this advice, this admonition, they said the following: technology changes, economic principles do not. In other words, in the economic field, the underlying economic principles will remain the same as those you have learned at BSE, no matter how much technological change accelerates, shaking up Joseph Schumpeter's famous process of creative destruction, and thus burying entire economic sectors while others that today we cannot even imagine emerge. Do not forget this teaching of Shapiro and Varian. It will save you many mistakes. I am concluding, and I would like to do so with a recommendation, with a sincere recommendation. In a few minutes, when you receive your master's diploma, you will automatically become highly qualified technical professionals, thanks to your effort and talent and the education quality of the BSc. This in itself is a significant achievement. I'm convinced of that. However, my suggestion is not to rest on your laurels. In the coming years, try to stay reasonably up to date with the academic advances in your respective areas of professional specialization, and if possible, broaden your intellectual horizons with readings in history, science, political philosophy, literature, and more. In the last book written by a twilight Henry Kissinger, called Leadership, this very, very controversial but always interesting statesman claimed, not without reason, that at present, reading a book with deep intellectual content has practically become a countercultural act. I encourage you to challenge Henry Kissinger's assertion with your curiosity and to strengthen your technical and intellectual capital until the end of your days. Individuals with high technical qualifications like you, who also make a continuous effort to cultivate themselves, are not only more appealing professionals, but also, and more importantly, are citizens who better understand the complex world in which we live and probably are capable of enjoying it more. I reiterate my sincere congratulations on your master's degree, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me, rector, vice rector, all the authorities, and thanks, everyone, for being here. So I wanted to talk to you briefly about a few things. One is congratulations, of course, should be the first thing. So that's a nice picture I took a couple of months ago. So my son is the good-looking fellow on the right. You don't need to say that he looks like his mother, because he does. He's also very smart, like his mother. But I understand this is a joyful occasion, and I actually encourage you to enjoy very much like these guys were doing. So in addition, I congratulate you because I expect rationally that you're going to do very well. So this is the last class I taught at Pompeu Fabra, the master's that some of you finished in economics and finance, and that's the class of 2005, 2006. Now, so I had the list. I'm not sure this is GDPR compliant, but I still have the list somewhere. And I started looking at the names, and I said it was wow after wow, because these were kids like you, and I don't know, at that time they just looked like kids. But first one in the list is managing economist, Copenhagen Economics, another associate professor at Zurich, the chief financial officer at Brain, a research fellow at the research department at Consob, is at the stock market regulator in Italy. Professor, director, senior partner, so on and so forth. This is just, 17 years from now. And it's only one or two I didn't locate, and this is because they have pretty common names, so I couldn't locate them. But all of them are doing really well, and you will too. That I have no doubt that you will. As a predecessor was saying, you're probably the best prepared, generation we've ever seen, and we hope it. Now, one reason why I'm so hopeful for you is because, in a sense, because of this. So this is, I'm old enough to have watched this movie early. It's called The Sound of Music, and this is Julie Andrews singing in the Austrian Alps. So it's a nice story about a family that actually has to fight against Nazism and so on, which, is one of the dangers we face right now. But importantly, I was in Innsbruck a couple of months ago. And you see the mountains there all full of snow. Now, in March this year, this should be the summer, by the way, and there's still snow. In March this year, there was almost no snow, at least not at that height. It was much further up. So we're going to need all your skills because there's a very big problem that we are facing, as you can imagine, it's climate change. Now, the reason why climate change is in a sense so puzzling is because we really have known about this for a very long time. So this is a quote from an Australian provincial newspaper, the Rodney and Otamatia Times, in the Science and Note News, 1912. It says, the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting it with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the air and to raise its temperature. Notice the date again, 1912. Not only that, but we already knew very long time ago that climate change can cause serious problems for humanity. Huntington, this is a paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, so economists know about this, already claimed that climate change is partially explained the fall of Rome, 1917. So we've known about this for a very long time. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story about our puzzlement and why this puzzles so much. That is based on a paper I've written with Manu Garcia, a PhD student in Washington University of St. Louis. David Ramos is a lawyer at my institution, Angel Sanchez, a mathematician there. So we need all skills to understand this problem. The question we're asking ourselves is, why does it seem that climate action is not happening sufficiently quickly? And one hypothesis we have is that evolution of social norms is transmitted in a very slow way in society, and the transmission between social groups makes the problem also complicated. For example, In another work with the same authors, we have argued that central banks should indeed take an interest in climate change. And as you'll see, they are taking an interest in climate change. But in 2015, before they started taking an interest in climate change, Mark Carney, then the governor of the Bank of England, pointed out that usually monetary policy horizon is about 2-3 years, financial stability at most a decade, climate, the view has to go 50 years or more. So it needs to change the way we operate. It needs to change our minds. In a sense, it needs people like you that come and actually start making things change. So what we did in this paper is we created indices of mentions to climate change in media, newspapers, in fact, general interest science journals, economics top 5, European Parliament questions, European central banks. We did some web scraping and look at all this. And then we proposed a network model of social norms transmission in the spirit of, in fact, this is a paper written by Coralio Ballester, Anthony Calvo-Armengol, and Yves Senou. Tony and Coralio were both members, or graduates, in fact, of the Barcelona School of Economics. So this is a very important work that, in a sense, arises out of the creation of work of people like you some years ago. Now, these models parameters can be estimated using what we call a VAR. So for the people in the audience that are not economists, this is not the football thing. No, football is very important these days, but it's something else. It's called vector autoregression. Using the indices. So let me explain you a little bit what we do. So we developed the climate change index with the universe of news in top newspapers, so 18 UK, 18 European, 12 American, US, 7 Australian, 7 Indian, 5 Canadian, and 2 Singaporean, 69 publications, using the keywords climate change. In a robustness, we have another list, very large list of terms. It doesn't make any difference. So following a methodology invented by Baker, Bloom, and some other authors, we standardize this series, average across papers by month, and we divide by the average. Basically, we create a series, an index this way. And this is what it looks like. So notice, we already knew in 1912 that there was a problem. But if you look at this index, it barely registers until essentially somewhere 2008, something like this. And there have been several climate summits before. So The Hague, there was the Kyoto Protocol adopted. As you can see, press didn't pay too much attention to the Kyoto Protocol approval and so on. And it's only when the IPCC fourth assessment is reported, 2007, 2008, that things start happening. When the Copenhagen Accord happens. But then, suddenly, the financial crisis comes and we more or less forget about this. And it's only recently, the end of the last century, that we start worrying about this again. So this is the scale of the problem. You know, it goes in and out of our attention, even though it's a serious problem that needs continuous action. And like I said, it's not that we recently learned about this. I gave you an interesting quote from a very, provincial newspaper, but in fact, the scientific research on carbon dioxide has been going on for 150 years. Mid-19th century, an Irish experimentalist first established that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Early 20th century realized that CO2 release could alter the Earth's climate. British engineer compiled the first empirical evidence of the greenhouse effect. This is all, by the way, from actually a very interesting book by a couple of science historians, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. Now, how about scientists? Okay, if you go to general interest science journals, interest has been very steady for a very long time. So it's not like the scientists have just recently realized about this. No, it's not only 150 years ago. If you look at the series of science, the mentions in journals has increased, but it basically was very high already at the end of last century. Now, how about economists? Because I need to be honest with this, and actually we haven't been good actors in this. So there was a White House Office Science Technology that started asking about this in 1980, so it's already a little bit late. What economists started arguing is climate change wouldn't produce new kinds of climates. This is from Tom Schelling, Nobel Prize economist, game theorist, very important person. He said, well, it will simply change the distribution of climatic zones on the Earth. So he suggested that, yeah, we can continue to burn fossil fuels without restriction, and they would just migrate and adapt. Essentially, what he was saying is, look, right now, climate change, what it's going to do is going to make Canada and Siberia more habitable. Other places will be less habitable. What's the problem? We just migrate to Canada and Siberia. That's what a clever, very clever economist said at the time. Yeah, so Schelling acknowledged that these historic migrations occurred in areas with fewer national boundaries, but nevertheless, he suggested adaptation would be the best response. Okay? So our story in this is not a nice one. In particular, he also said significant reduction in concentration of CO2 will require stringent policies such as hefty taxes. We now know this. The strategies suggested later, climate modification adaptation, are likely to be more economical. There's very sad effects, but in the end, it will be more costly to do stringent abatements. So that's very sad. So it's a very smart economist in 1980 telling the American president, don't worry, we'll deal with this. Okay. Now, has this gotten any better? Well, if we just look at mentions in top 5 economic journals, so that's the most important journals in the discipline, looking at abstracts or titles in the last 30 years, it barely registers. So climate change, it's mentioned 19 times. You know, if you compare to, I don't know, marketing, it's about the same times that marketing is mentioned. Of course, an order of magnitude less than monetary policy, about the same sense as game theory. It just, you know, there's no comparison. So in the top journals, it's not just Schelling, in the top journals of the profession, we haven't paid barely any attention. Now, if we look at all the economics journals and not just the top 5, it's a little bit better. But economists start noticing this not much earlier, and certainly much later than other scientists, but not much earlier than journalists, for goodness sake. So it seems like there's work to do. Now it's a little bit better, but you know, also as a percentage of the all articles published is very little. All right. How about other institutions? We've mentioned scientists, we've mentioned journalists. How about parliamentarians? Well, you know, European Parliament is an index of questions in the European Parliament. They do a little better. But again, it's only around 2005, 2007 that they start waking up. And also, attention diminishes, just like for newspapers, it diminishes during the financial crisis, and it's only now that we're doing any better. Well, finally, central banks. Central banks wake up even later. So central banks start worrying about this. You remember the quote I gave you by the Mark Carney, the Bank of England governor in 2015. It took even 5 more years so that central banks start noticing. Finally, now they're noticing, and there's a good reason for this. It's very likely that climate change is going to harm very quickly the financial stability of countries, and therefore they have a mandate to do something. So finally they've realized, and now they're starting to work on this, which means that banks are also starting to work on this. I have a friend that works in the city of London in one of the biggest banks, HSBC, and he was saying he started working on these things 10 years ago. It were 4 or 5 people in his office for a long time. Now there are 100 people in his office. So climate change is going to be a big deal for the future in many dimensions, and your expertise is going to be needed for that. All right, so what we did after we gathered all this data, we took up a simple theoretical framework. I was going to write an equation here, but I thought we've pestered them enough with equations, and also there is this famous saying that for each equation you write in a popular book, you lose half the audience. So I said, okay, fine, I don't want to lose you half immediately. But I think it's nice to mention the theory because it's based on work by Coralio, Tony, who I said are BSc graduates and PhDs, both of them, and Yves Zenou, who's a good friend and professor that also visited the UAB and UPF for many times. Now, in this model, the benefit of an action depends on what I do, but also on what others like I do. In a sense, we are all connected, and it's not just my action. Remember this, we're trying to think about social norms and how they influence one another. It's a linear quadratic model, so for those of you who have studied these kind of things, you'll notice that, once you have this, you're going to have that equilibrium actions are going to be linear functions of past actions of others in my network of reference. And therefore, we're going to construct a model that's going to be easy to estimate. The coefficients can be easy to estimate with a vector autoregression. So what does the model tell us? What the model tells us is at 1/4, all variables are affected by their own lags, big deal. So there is some hysteresis, so the past effects. The only thing that seems to be connected with one another is Europarlament affects the media, okay? And that's basically it. So I can summarize, this is a big slide. I shouldn't have big slides, don't do big slides, but the basic idea here is Parliament listens to the media, media listens to Parliament, no one else listens to anyone else in the data. So there is a GDP effect, most likely 2020 pandemic shock, because it disappears if I estimate before 2020, so it means that somehow the pandemic has done something to our mind. And now we are attuned to the possibility that climate change can indeed be a big deal. So that's basically the take-up. There are some boundaries between science and academia and the decision makers. And one of the things that it's important for the future is that you need to do something about this, because otherwise we're in a bad shape. So in a conclusion, I think the red final line says, we need you. You have done good work, but that's not the end of it. It's not just that you're going to be CEO or advisor to the president or to a ministry or something else. Your positive impact on our societies is going to be a huge deal, and we expect lots of you, and we need you, and that's it. Thank you very much.